start the third day of the conference. Nice to see you Saturday morning in such a number. Well, we start with our keynote lecturer, Renee Timmers, please. She will talk about communication music ensembles. You know her.
Thank you very much. So lovely to be here, and thank you for organizing this great conference. So my talk is about expression and communication in musical ensembles. Am I audible in the back as well? So in this, I'm interested to explore what expression and communication means in musical contexts, as opposed to linguistic context, for example. And in this, as a sort of framework, I assume the Western classical tradition of performers playing more and audiences. And so expression is and communication is between performers as well as with audiences. But later on we'll see that the score doesn't necessarily have to be there. But just to present the context, this is the framework that I have in mind, is Western classical music traditions. So we'll first look at how has empirical research defined these in solo performance contexts, and then we'll think about how this relates to ensemble communication and expression. So I'm looking at solo performance as well as ensemble performance, and I'll take two different perspectives, so an information processing perspective and an embodied cognition perspective, and see how these two types of approaches would examine expression and communication, and maybe we'll get to some kind of conclusion, and which is maybe to look at ensemble performance as process and as product. So this information processing perspective on musical communication goes with, classical paper in this area is by Kendall and Carteret, and it's indeed lots of people refer to this article when explaining musical communication. And in this paper they explain how a message or an expressive intention is transmitted from a composer to a performer to a listener, and is recoded from one state to another. So the composer might have an idea, a cognitive message that is translated into notation, and from notation this is translated into acoustic signal by performers, and listeners might decode again this message when listening to it. So I think there are a couple of problems with this model, and we'll talk about those later, but let's see what this offers us as well, because it's also quite an intuitive model and has certain benefits that I'll explain next. So the idea is that the composer, performer and listener have certain implicit as well as explicit knowledge that is to a degree shared and also unshared. So Carolyn Palmer wrote this overview article in Annual Psychological Review in 1997, which is again quite a landmark article, where she explains that performance expression refers to large small variations in timing, intensity or dynamics, timbre and pitch that form the microstructure of a performance and differentiate it from another performance of the same music. And she also explains that the communicative, so this expression is to convey an interpretation of the score or the musical composition to audiences. So this communicative content in music performance includes the performer's conceptual interpretation of the musical composition, as well, and another, so one function of interpretation is to highlight particular structural content, and another function is to highlight particular emotional content of the music. So this kind of communicative model of a performer's intention, that is, so for example, an emotional intention that is translated into acoustic and musical cues and then decoded by listeners to infer emotion, is very often used, and indeed very common. It's the most common model in psychological emotion research, originally formulated by Gabrielson and Justin, but here this example is from a recent publication by Patrick Lauker and colleagues. So the idea is, yeah, so in this sense you can look at the composer's achievement, so what did the composer intended and what do listeners perceive from it, and also the performer's achievement, what kind of emotional intention did the performer have, and what the listeners inferred. And the sounds are the ways of transmission. And the similar, I adapted this picture by just replacing intended emotion with intended phrasing. So we can say what the phrasing the performer has in mind, and that is translated into acoustic changes, so changes in tempo, changes in dynamics, and then from that the performer might infer phrasing. Okay, so as I said, we'll discuss some of the limitations of this perspective in the next, when we talk more about an embodied approach. But I think this way of thinking can be very powerful. For example, in a dialogue, in a teaching environment. So if one of my PhD students, Henrik Meisner, has looked into, she was a recorder teacher for a long time, and she wanted to let her recorder students perform more expressively, or to put expression to the center of music making. And she was interested in exploring what are the methods to do so. So with other teachers, she did an action research and looked at what people do. And also, well, the initial one, something that came out was dialogic teaching approach seems quite effective. So just by asking open questions to the students, for example, about what is the character of this music and how do you convey this in your playing. So what is the way of communicating that in sound, and also looking at the score, what is your interpretation and what is the character that you think. So I'll play a video shortly. So I looked at the effectiveness of using this dialogic teaching approach to enhance expressive performance. So a group of students these were high school pupils. They used, a group of them was taught using a dialogic teaching approach, and the other, so talking about the expressive character of the music, and the other group focused on accuracy and technique. And the people performed the music at the start of the lesson and then at the end of the lesson, and these graphs show ratings of these performances by external raters who were aligned to which order these performances were played in. And they were rated according to expressiveness and accuracy. And as you can see, the experimental group especially improved in expressiveness, in particular in the minor piece, while the control group improved in a major piece but not in a minor piece, and accuracy went up for both of the groups. So this is some experimental evidence, but we also interviewed participants, and they were, when being asked to reflect on what were useful aspects of these lessons, they pointed out that these questions about expressive character of the music was some of the things that were particularly new for them, and they made them aware of that it's not just playing the notes, but doing much more with the music. So explicit discussion of a performer's interpretation of music can be a pedagogical tool to increase musical awareness and enhance expressive performance. But now let's get into the limitations of this perspective. So it suggests as if abstract concepts are the origin of expressive performance, so that you have to sort of start with an idea and then put it into sounds, and then these sounds is just cues. So it reduces sounds to cues rather than the thing itself that is music. And also expression is not just, it reduces expression to sound, while actually we might say it's much more than only sound, it's also the body that is involved and the environment, so it's more external. So as Dan Wilkinson has argued, it negates the primacy of the sounding performance, and we'll get into that next. And I would argue also the primacy of the embodiedness of performance. So music can be known through sound and body interaction. There's no need for cognitive transformations. So it's not. So what would a embodied perspective indeed on solo performance argue that expression and communication consist of? Well, Dan Wilkinson argued that performance lies beneath all hearings of scores, including all imaginings of scores, and thus all conceptions of composition. So without a performance of music, you don't have an idea of how the composition would sound, and indeed composers use these notions of performance to imagine how music will be. So the performance is the thing that is primary, and conceptions and occasions come next. Andrea Schiavio, a PhD student, a former PhD student of mine, also argues strongly for this embodied perspective on musical development. So he looked at origins of musical development in infants and showed this attentional shift around 6 to 8 months old infants, from where the sound becomes the goal of exploratory actions. So, and I'll show that more in detail in the next slide. So he defines stadial musical acts, so where the music is the object, and he distinguishes between these initially or original stadial musical acts that are exploratory, and they become unified into constituted stadial musical acts. So this might be a little bit hard to read, but the top one is proto-musicality, so the mother-infant interaction, this affective interaction through sounds and bodily gestures, that is sort of proto-musical, but then with explorations of sounds, so the infant starts to recognize that it can make sounds through actions. And this is then seen as more strictly speaking musical origins. So these explorations become oriented towards sonic affordances, and those develop into goal-oriented patterns of behavior. So those are the original paleo musical acts, and they can develop that further into more structured patterns, integrated patterns that are on an instrument, for example. So maybe a bit more, less theoretically and more concretely, my PhD student Shen Li has looked at the role of embodiment in producing and creating timbres on a piano. So she's interested to know how performers are able to play different timbres on a piano, while acousticians say that this is very hard to do. You might hear some differences in keystrokes or noise on the keyboard, but otherwise there's little difference. So what in interviews with performers and also in the experimental study, she noticed that actually, again, it's not about the sound only, it's about the body interaction with the instrument as well as the sound, and that makes up how we think about performance and how we perceive the timbres that we're making. So an embodied perspective on timbre creation mentions that expressive intentions are multimodal, so they are informed by actions, by tactile feedback, by sound, by imagery, feelings, as well as linguistic concepts. And these correspondences develop and are linked in real time. So in these interviews with pianists, to give an example, one of the pianists explains that if she plays with her higher hand position, that relates to a rich finger key space, making the sound open and rich. So she uses her hands as articulators and imagines that those a round kind of articulator also gives a round and rich sound. As opposed to play, as someone else explained, if I play with the lower wrist position, this helps to play a deeper and more elephant sound. So that it's holistic, and those productions are integrated with the concept of sound. We can also look at listeners. So if we present only the visuals or the audio to listeners, or the visual and audio information, and we ask them, so we have asked the performer to play, for example, tense and relaxed, and we ask the listeners to rate, is this tense or relaxed? We can see here the differences in ratings. So if it's audio only, the difference in ratings between of tense in the relaxed context and in the tense context is only small. But if we have visual information, this difference is larger. So the visual only condition in this case is the best communicative dimension for tension. So I'll play you, and yeah, it's okay. I'll play you an example. And yeah, the question to you is this tense or relaxed playing? So who of you thought it was tense? And who thought it was relaxed? Okay, so it was a combination. So the visuals were tense and the sound was relaxed. So this was not influenced with the cue, this is what you did afterwards. So you were both right. But indeed, if we would have, as you saw from the results, the visual information is quite communicative in this case. Okay, so part of this embodied perspective, the power is then that it puts real-time action central to the performance. It emphasizes sounds as action goals and emphasizes this distributed nature of performance and communication. So distributed between the instrument, the body and the sound and the environment. But this was about ensemble performance, so now we'll look at indeed how these two translate into ensemble performance. And one of the things that is often said in the context of ensemble playing, that musicians develop a shared understanding of the music through rehearsal and performance. So this shared understanding means they have a shared notion of the musical structure, of the character, as well as aspects of tension and release. And indeed, a successful ensemble often is said to need to have shared performance goals and ideas of performance outcomes. So, what it means by performance goals? Well, you could say, well, we're striving for high quality performance. We have certain ideas of the style that we want to play in, but also maybe the tempo and the dynamics and articulation that we're intending. So indeed, these performance goals and outcomes are quite a few. So you can have share ideas about how the expressive interpretation of the music is going to be. So including emotional intentions, musical character, stylistic requirements, but also about the ensemble characteristics. What is the tuning that we're striving for, or the kind of synchronization? What is the balance between instruments? And indeed an idea of musical structure. Now, some of the so we can look at maybe at rehearsals and see what people are talking about. So are they talking about indeed agreeing on the interpretation of the musical score? Are they explicitly mentioning certain interpretations? So expressive and interpretive interpretations. So the discussion of performance features in ensemble rehearsals is what we can have analyzed, and then indeed, as Jane Ginsburg yesterday mentioned that these performance cues are powerful in supporting the memorization of performance, and indeed they could support ensemble performance. So Nicola Pennell, a PhD student, she adopted this framework by Roger Chaffin and Jane Ginsburg, and applied it to her analysis of rehearsals of ensembles. So she went through the transcripts of and video recordings and looked at whether they talked about basic features of the performance or interpretive and expressive features, or maybe talked about strategy for rehearsal. So this is a case study of of a vocal quintet, and this quintet are good performers who came together for an MA in solo and ensemble singing. And so she was able to follow them from the first rehearsal to the final rehearsal before a performance, before a concert, and looked at different aspects such as how much time is allocated to music making or just to talking in these rehearsals, and also what is talked about. Are they talking about basic aspects, strategic aspects of rehearsing, or interpretive aspects of the interpretation of the music, or something else, such as just social aspects. So as you see, there's this development over rehearsals that there's less talk about basic aspects and a bit more interpretive aspects in the later rehearsal. But in general, there's more music making towards the end, the last rehearsals, and more talking in the first rehearsals. So we can have a short look at one of these rehearsals and see how we interpret, how we code these utterances. So I'll play you the excerpt, and then you see the coding. I should have one of the tempos should be probably also basic, but anyway. Can you stop the recording, please, again? So the limitations of this perspective is much of the expressive interpretation remains implicit, and indeed rehearsal progress is to a large degree made through doing. And actually, I said Keller's article, they can be given as evidence for having a shared understanding, but on the other hand, he also very strongly argues for the role of action simulation. And also in Hadley's study, they use DMS to sort of interrupt this action simulation. So it is we use our motor knowledge to be able to synchronize with others. And of course, the familiarity with a co-performer's part or style doesn't mean that you have to know to have exactly the same sharing of musical representations. So you don't have to have the same kind of concepts. So what would be an embodied perspective on ensemble performance? Well, that emphasizes dynamic, adaptive, real-time and distributed nature of performance. So indeed people, so it is more real-time, it's not conceptual, it's done in doing. It is so mutually adaptive to different between people, as well as instruments, as well as sounds. And yeah, so I think this picture shows it nicely. It's quite hard to find an example of how this can be investigated. So, but one way, I think, so this study that I'm now referring to didn't actually explicitly use an embodied approach, but we did, but it does show a concept that could be adopted. So ensemble communication from this perspective is defined as intended alignment of sounds through goal-directed action. So alignment can be done through synchronization, tuning, balance, alignment in articulation, and bodily gestures. So in the case of a string quartet, in this example, it's the sounds that communicate, as well as the body gestures and the actions producing those sounds. And through alignment, that's where communication happens. So we can interpret an ensemble as members of a communicative network, and in principle expect all directional adaptation. So adaptation between all performers. Maybe the flexibility of this network shouldn't be too big, because then you have a risk of instability. If people adapt too much to each other, you go all directions. And there's an influence of context as well as intentionality on this adaptation. So for example, this is a picture that shows how much people adapt to each other. So this is a correlation matrix showing the violin 1, and here's violin 1, 2, 3, 4, well, viola and cello. And this is correlations between these performances in onset intervals. And if it's a positive correlation at a certain length, it shows whether someone is following the other. So in this case, the viola adapts or follows to the violin 1, and the cello adapts, the violin 1 adapts to the cello. Here we see mutual adaptation between the viola and the violin 2 and the cello. Sorry, violin 2 and the viola, and this is mutual adaptation between violin 2 and the cello. So a network perspective on performance would argue for these mutual adaptations. So what is expression in this embodied perspective? Well, it would centralize the energy, entrainment and excitement of live performance and embodied engagement with music from listeners, but as well as creative emergence of novel sounds, ideas, feelings and movements through a process over time, and through interaction between the performers. I'll just have a look at the time. Sorry. Okay, so let's wrap up by looking at ensemble, process and product. So I think if we look at ensemble performance, it becomes very clear that expression and communication are strongly embodied. So a dynamic, adaptive, real-time and distributed concept of expression and communication is what is needed to understand ensemble performance, because it really happens in real time between people, and it's the alignment of sounds as well as embodied interactions that make the ensemble coherent rather than having exactly shared understanding of the music. Still, musicians bring and develop ideas about the ensemble performance as product. So they do have certain ideas of how interaction should be realized, what kind of synchronization objectives people have, what is the balance that they might strive for, or the tuning. And as well, they might have ideas about performance, expressive timings and dynamics. But these things are not, these are emergent from the process. So the process is first, and then maybe aspects of the product develop. So to close off with an example of how maybe these notions of ensemble aesthetics or the product of ensembles might change over time. I have here two short fragments from Mädchens am Spielrade, sung by Emma Enes and Ludmila Janovic. So the first one is a very early performance where I'd like you to listen to the relationship between the singer and the piano accompaniment. And this is very different in the two performers, so they have different aesthetics or different ideas about the product of performance. But this is realized through differences in process. so the second one is very strongly horizontal, while the other one is more, no, sorry, vertical, while the other one is more horizontal. So to conclude, we looked at the benefits and limitations of an information processing perspective on expression and communication, and especially the explicit discussion of musical character and performance cues that can be helpful in teaching and learning context. We also looked at the relevance of an embodied perspective, so sounds as action goals, communication as alignment, and expression as distributed. And then maybe looking from, looking as on ensemble performance as a process is especially aligned with the embodied perspective. But then we also should think about what are the product goals that people might have, and this is something that arises from the process. But these product goals are actually not so much investigated in research, so definitely something to investigate in future studies. So I'd like to acknowledge the contributions from different PhD students as well as collaborators in the University of Sheffield, of Birmingham, Satoshi Endo and Alan Wick.
Thank you very much. Very good seeing you. So, please, we have time for questions. What to ask? Perhaps I start to break the ice. I was a bit triggered by this part where you say adaptation to each other, and then it's adaptation to of the ensemble members to each other, and then it should not be going too far, and then they adapt to each other, and then they in fact lose focus. So how that refers to kind of leadership or a way of communication? Is it democratic or a bit more authoritarian? How?
Yeah, so this indeed, I was a little bit quick about that. I'll go back to here. Yeah, so this is actually a study by Alan Wing and colleagues who simulated this. So they look at how much, they call it phase relationships of phase correction. So if someone plays a bit ahead or too early, you might correct a phase to that kind of change in the next event. So the idea is that you compensate for each other. But this kind of network of compensations, if you model it and you simulate it, you can show that if people do this too much, you get overshooting, so you get overcorrection. And sort of the network, the performance gets unstable.
And
so
in a way it works.
It worsens, yes, indeed. So there should be some inhibitants of if someone is late, you don't go the whole, you don't do it exactly the same next one. So people have an internal, or some inhibition in doing this adaptation. But generally, so you ask about leadership. So mutual adaptations are the ones that make synchronization happen most strongly. So indeed, it should be more democratic rather than being led from a certain person. The other thing is that maybe, I'm here saying about the influence of context. So if you sit next to someone, of course, you'll be influenced more. Yeah. So that's more of a, it's not that you're thinking, well, she's the leader or he, so therefore I have to attend to that person. It's more it's more embodied. So it is definitely, it's more that you're sitting next to someone, and if that someone has very strong or clear onset, you'll be more influenced by that person. So it's less conceptually driven, more real-time and actual event driven. Well.
About this study here, so did you measure the onset of the instruments by looking at the with computer screen and clicking with a mouse, or some automatic procedure?
Automatic procedures. So this was done with collaboration with Satoshi Endo.
Ah, okay.
And so these performers were all separately recorded, and there was a low-pass filtering and a detection, and then,
So then I have another question. So is it possible to give the performers feedback that they're either overcompensating or undercompensating, and then that they actually learn to come towards the middle?
That's very difficult because these phase corrections are rather automatically done rather than consciously. So if people are consciously starting to do certain things, that might actually disrupt how well it is going. But maybe with all these things also, often conscious things are useful at the start, and then things become automatic. So maybe it might help for a while.
Well, I could also perhaps refer to a question that a young colleague had the first day of the conference about the string quartet, and then how to make these roles, how the others should listen. Did you ask that question? That was interesting. So it's more refers to Renee, and how to make others to do as the leader wants, or something to that. Well, that's the question. That refers more how to do, or how to help musicians really to use this knowledge.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think so partly the idea, well, one very concrete thing is just pay more attention to what the body is doing than just than is done typically in music lessons. So although we, of course, through gestures, or we do attend to it to some extent, but not much. So being communicative in those ways could help. And maybe we can actually. So the other thing is that the attacks and the way we play it should give the information. So we could be much more clear in our articulation, for example. In the clarity. Yeah, in the music part. So making.
So less fights, verbal fights, and then.
Yeah, indeed.
So.
Yeah.
Well, I must say, my professor was your student actually, and she.
So I have to be blamed.
No. She told us exactly this. So I'm the leader of the quartet, but I was a bit passive at the beginning because I didn't know how to do it. And everybody tended to go to rush or to fall behind. So she told me I must be more suggestive in my movements. And then I started to go on the other hand and
do opposite.
To suggestive. Yeah. So I must go back a bit on the middle. And actually, when you have that problem in the quartet, for example, because I know that feel the best, if we have a problem with problems with tempo, it's the one person who starts it, and we all rush.
Yeah.
For example, and that all goes to catastrophe. So we must put metronome on and play it a few times, and then it is all clear. And if there is a problem, somebody has to adjust it by himself when he practices alone at home, so that we could all know what to do. And ideas are actually, we are all different persons and we have different ideas, but they must be universal by the style of piece, the composer idea, so dynamics that are written down in the score. And everything must be democratic, actually. But there must be a leader, so it doesn't have to be a first violin. We had a first violin that was always Russian, so the cello was keeping tempo, for example. And we must know each other's good sides and bad sides, so we can know what to do in a performance. So it depends on the type of piece. That's Haydn quartet. If I'm not wrong, it's really hard to keep a tempo. But if you have a romantic quartet, like Schubert or something, it tends to be more expressive and the tempo is a bit not so precise, and it matters what is the pace.
So I think that this sort of embodied perspective is something that is very intuitive for performers and makes a lot of sense, and really, I think it's not so very, in a way, not very new. But then, on the other hand, if people start to talk about it and theorize it, they tend to adopt more of an information processing perspective. So that's why I think it's useful to know about these different ways of thinking about what is happening in performance.
Yes,
sorry.
Just one more sentence.
Okay.
Our professor did that exactly because we didn't know. We had a feeling, intuitive feeling about that, but we didn't know exactly how can we use it.
Okay, we have another 2 questions. But first.
Do you have any data, have you asked your subjects about some self-report or self-evaluation? What are their insights about those things that you were objectively trying to...
So for this this study, we also asked people how they think they attend to others. So how much attention do people give to the different performers in the group, and also we asked other people how much do you think someone else attends to the others. And this was not exactly in line with the findings that were measured, but I think they both are probably true. So it might just be that you attend to someone at certain crucial moments. So like at the beginning, you do need a leader to start people off or to make transitions. This is more, what this measures is more the overall thing, what happens whilst playing. So the small kind of corrections that you're doing, but if something more explicit is happening, then maybe a leader will need to come in, and it needs to be more deliberate.
And last question?
Thank you for the very nice talk. It's great to hear. I was wondering just about your conclusion in terms of you made a very nice comparison of the pros and cons of the two epistemological approaches, if you like. So, old school artificial intelligence, information processing, and embodied forms, or whatever it's called. So what's your conclusion? Is it we take from each what we like and we let them be, or do we want to try some sort of theoretical as well reconciliation, if you like? So some sort of new programs in which the two are going to meet and converge, and not just be. I mean, you know that I told you linguistics is a big issue, but in music psychology, I guess it's an issue as well.
Yeah, I think so.
So what's your take on this?
I think we need to have an embodied approach, but we shouldn't forget what some of the important findings from the other approach, and maybe the other approach some aspects of it need to be modified, but then we can use them for our purposes, so we don't have to dismiss it totally.
Well, here are questions. Thank you very much.